To start with, it seems that you guys at Snyk have had a wonderful last 12 months from a funding perspective, revenue increase, employee count increase, and even acquisitions. What are some of the key things you can talk about that happened in this pandemic year?
It's been a crazy year. So we've grown, Snyk's general trajectory, we've gone from 23 to 84 to 250 to 450 people in annual increments in terms of staff. So we've done a fair bit here. This year was a bit different in sort of lumpiness because there was a pause in Q2, which frankly, actually in a hyper growth, despite the sort of the undercurrent of it with COVID. So it might not have been for the best reasons, but pausing hiring in the midst of this hyper growth was actually such a breath of fresh air, being able to like cement a little bit of the processes and sort of have some familiarity and kind of cope together with the sort of the more personal challenges everybody has kind of across the pandemic. But still, we've grown from 250 to 450. We've grown, I think, about 200% in revenue and sort of a similar number in ARR. We launched two kind of key products, which are infrastructure as code, and we've acquired a company called Deep Code, which introduced Snyk Code. So, sort of two big products coming along, and also acquired at the very tail end of the year a company called Manifold, which is sort of a great set of talented individuals helping us bolster the platform. So really, we grew all around, and I think internally, just a ton of scaling around. We've really transitioned from startup to scale up, if you will, over the course of these sort of 12 to 18 months. And we did raise about $350 million during that period of time as well. And it felt like there was a sequence of these sort of 6 to 7 months apart type fundraisers. Really kind of almost overwhelming demand from investors. So first class problems, but still something we had to manage over the course of the year.
Oh, amazing. Well, congrats on all of that. So maybe as a jump off point, what is Snyk?
So Snyk is a developer first security company. And what we mean by that is, the company was created on the belief that security has to be built into the development process because nothing else scales. And especially as you talk about DevOps and cloud and kind of a modernized surrounding. And that to achieve that, you need to build a developer tooling company, not a security company. And that was really like our light bulb moment, is to build a company that put the needs of the developers and how do we delight the developer first, versus despite the fact that the person signing the checks is oftentimes the security buyer. So that's really like the core of us. We're about 5.5 years old, and we started on sort of more of a Snyk open source. We can talk about sort of the different product evolutions, and I talked about the two products we launched, but we started off with this dev first mentality, tackling open source security, secure the open source components that we use, and have grown to what we call today cloud native application security, which is in a cloud native context in which developers are more and more empowered and they manage increasingly parts of the infrastructure, in this sort of cloud setup, everything becomes an API. So basically we secure everything in the repo. If you look at files from Docker files to Terraform files to all these different aspects. So that's sort of a Snyk in a nutshell.
Right. And
we can talk more bottom up and such.
Snyk is part of an emerging category that you guys have actually helped define called DevSecOps. Do you want to talk about what that is and maybe contrast it with DevOps?
Yeah, DevSecOps is at the gist of it. It's about sort of putting security into in the middle of Dev and Ops, but it's about adapting security to the DevOps motion. So generally, DevOps has predicated on breaking the barriers between developers and operations, about independent teams that can kind of take the ball in one end of the court and run with it, all the way to the other, and do that repeatedly without external dependencies and kind of continuously. Security hasn't gotten the memo as an industry. It's still operating as a separate entity. So teams are not independent oftentimes they get dictated to, so they don't really control their destiny. It's oftentimes not continuous, it's not automated enough, a lot of manual reviews and manual processes. And so at a high level, DevSecOps is about changing that. It's about building a security model that allows you to ship continuously and through independent teams, but still be secure in the process. And that's just mean dropping the security controls. And then there's, just like DevOps, you kind of ask 5 experts, you get 10 opinions about the exact definition of DevSecOps. But fundamentally, it's about bringing security into the DevOps fold. And that requires transforming the security industry and the underlying kind of security methodologies.
And the fundamental reason for this and the fundamental premise is that security, a lot of the security tools were invented for a different world, right? Whether that's firewalls or endpoint security, that was invented for the sort of the previous generation, but in a world where you have cloud and microservices and containers, that has been breaking. Is that the idea?
Yeah, there's kind of two things being mixed. There's DevOps and cloud. So DevOps drives the need that I mentioned before about dev-first security. It's the idea that the decisions around security are being made by developers, and that you want the security control to be near the decision maker. And so, and it's not a new need. It's maybe just a growing. It grew in kind of importance over time, alongside sort of the dev first security solution to the DevOps change. The cloud change happened, and what cloud did is it turned IT into app. So pre-cloud, applications were mostly some code and some libraries sitting on top of this sort of hefty central IT stack, which might have been your like central IT apps and like databases and such. You had, the team manage your data center, your infrastructure, your sort of VMs, and those IT teams were fairly security minded, and they had IT security solutions. And now a lot of those layers have become APIs, and those APIs are now managed out of the repo as part of a development process, right? Containers versus VMs is a good sort of way to think about it. And so they no longer require an IT security solution, they require an application security solution. And so really that's the different transition where you could have done dev first security just for the classic kind of code and libraries of the app. But we think that the right scope of responsibility for developers today is really the sort of cloud native scope that includes these different components.
Okay, thank you. So let's jump into the product. So when you guys started initially, I believe the initial product was focused on helping secure open source projects, right? Was that the origin from a product standpoint?
There was an interesting kind of ambiguity with our name, which I think might have even kind of served us well, which is we were open source security. So on one hand, you feel like it's securing open source. It's security that is open source. In practice, it was securing your use of open source. So you're consuming open source libraries, and there's an ownership paradigm problem there, which is you download this stuff from the internet. Nobody's really got your back. You need to know what you are using. You need to make sure it's vulnerability free and maintain that over time. So that's what we started with. I think when I think about reusable lessons here, what was interesting for us is we set out to build a developer tooling company following the developer tooling playbook, but we're attacking the security industry. So when we started with a very much the dev tooling playbook, which was pick a stack and deliver, pick something fairly narrow and deliver a great developer experience on that stack, win over that community. And so we build open source security or securing open source usage in Node.js, so mostly NPM packages, and which we felt was a niche that was big enough and small enough, big enough to care, to sort of have some commercial viability, but also small enough for us to make it to the top and become the standard in that ecosystem. And that worked really well to get developer adoption and really quite poorly to get revenue. And so as it turns out, security, if the dev tooling playbook is go deep, stay deep, you see Heroku, you see New Relic staying in Ruby land for a good while when they started. A security person needs breadth. They need, if you solve a security threat, but you only solve it for 50% of my apps, you're not very helpful. Security, I'm going to need to buy another tool or find another solution for the other 50% because I need to cover against this threat across 80%, 90% of my stack. And so when we started with this open source security, which proved to be it was a specific need and problem, and it was helped by the Equifax breach that kind of helped raise awareness during that time. But it was also a problem that was, we could kind of conquer that developer, but we managed to scale it horizontally to additional languages. So that was the first exercise. Only once that was quite established, it's not done. It continues. These languages keep evolving and changing, and there's more languages to be added. But once that was evolved, we expanded into containers, really following customer demand. People realized everything we build has this question about how is it dev first? How do we rethink the security problem from a dev first angle? For containers, it felt the industry has been seeing containers as the evolution of the VM, and they've been trying to retrofit VM patching practices onto containers, while we saw containers as the evolution of the app. And so just that angle, that statement led us to build a different solution to addressing it. Containers was very successful. And then subsequently this year, we accelerated that more with that path to securing everything in the repo. I think another interesting learning that we had there is we shipped every new product we've added, and now we do it intentionally. Container was a bit more improvisation. We ship it as an add-on first. So we don't ship, crap products, pardon my French here. We ship very good products, but very narrow ones, and we ship them as add-ons, and always developer friendly, always delivering on that promise. And then as we broadened and beefed up those products, we increased the price accordingly, and eventually we made those products standalone, so they can also be purchased even without buying, one of the other products. And that has become a very capable, like a very healthy methodology for us, and we adopt that for new products as well. Infrastructure as code, think infrastructure as code, which secures Terraform scripts and the likes today.
Yeah. Do you want to explain?
Graduated.
Do you want to explain what that is, maybe for people that are not familiar with the concept?
For sure. So I don't know if I need to explain containers. Would it be worthwhile explaining containers?
No, that's pretty okay.
That's established.
Yep.
So infrastructure as code. Increasingly, more and more of your infrastructure is automated instead of spinning up. The first iteration of infrastructure as code tools that came along to automate. Originally, you would log in, you would SSH to some server, you'd provision a machine that comes up, you'd SSH into it, or someone would start installing stuff on it. And then there was a layer of tools called Puppet, Chef, like that generation of tools came along and introduced automation. So instead of you logging in and SSHing, running those things, you would actually have something automated run it. And then subsequently, solutions like Terraform came along, which are more cloud-minded. And they manage not just cloud, but they're just sort of more modern, more dev-oriented around how much control you have and how sophisticated your infrastructure configuration is. At that point, you have code in your repositories that sets up your infrastructure, and that code, like any other, can have bugs and security mistakes. For example, you probably didn't know that Kubernetes by default runs as root, and so you need to explicitly tell it, do not run as root when you don't want that extra capability in case that machine got compromised. And so that's one of thousands of different security mistakes you might make. But developers are not security experts. And so they need a system that in a developer-friendly fashion helps them identify these problems and then fix them. So our view, once again, for this one, there's a world of cloud security. It focuses on more of a data center in the cloud type approach. Come on, log in, see which doors did you leave open for an attacker to walk in. We took more of a developer approach and said, hey, as a developer, you just asked me to make infrastructure decisions. Help me out, right? Help me figure out, am I doing this correctly? And so we built things. We built a solution that's Git-oriented that connects to your source code repositories, flags these issues in developer-friendly fashion, and aims to automatically fix them. We open fix pull requests that we basically are kind of like a helper developer sitting along next to you and help you address the vulnerabilities or the security mistakes that you've made. And that's been our approach. Like, hopefully that starts to sound consistent with the other products that I've mentioned.
And what about Snyk code? What does that do?
So Snyk code is interesting to an extent. It expands a little bit more into the history. In the world of vulnerabilities, actually the majority of the industry today is focused on not these open source components or all that, but rather on custom vulnerabilities in your own code. You write code, you write bugs, some of them are vulnerabilities. And so there's a plethora of like an alphabet soup here of SAST, DAST, IST, all sorts of like static analysis, dynamic analysis, interactive, which is instrumentation based, all sorts of solutions trying to uncover in different ways vulnerabilities in your own custom code. The one that has the most promise and the most anguish in it is SAST, which is theoretically scanning your code, doing program analysis, so just inspecting your code automatically and figuring out whether there is a security mistake here. Can I identify a path that an attacker might take from injecting some data into a form field and going all the way into your database and stealing some data out of it? And SAST is a great promise because you connect to the source code and it has full visibility. In practice, it's a very, very mathematically hard problem, and it resulted in a decade's worth of tools. I'm responsible for one of them. I built AppScan Source quite a few years ago now, that are just laden with false positives. They find issues very, very well, but they're laden with false positives. And so what we've done with Snyk code is we figured we will not enter the SAST world unless we can really change the paradigm here, unless we can actually build something that is fast enough for CI/CD, which these tools are not, and that is accurate enough to actually be usable to developers, because as it stands, these tools are not usable for developers. And the interesting play here is we actually ended up acquiring a company that does this in Zurich, DeepCode, which was not a security company. It came in as a quality analysis, super sophisticated, machine learning based. I can kind of ramble on about how amazing the technology is. But I think maybe the interesting path is that to find that we kind of scoured in the market for all the sort of security static analysis companies that we might work with. And it was actually in the quality world that we found the technology that we firmly believe is the best one. So we've acquired them, we're bringing them onto the platform. Now the product is actually now available, and it completes, again, that view of the repository, which is we secure the code that's in your repository as well.
Yeah, actually, as a quick aside, I'd be interested to learn more about how they do it. So they just train models based on code, and
you're right. This is sort of a data driven. Yeah, so it's a combination of sort of a program analysis using machine learning. So it surveys all the code on GitHub, if you will, and identifies, for starters, it trains sources and sinks. So it identifies APIs that might be sources of information, or might be destinations of sort of sensitive actions, like a form field and like a database. But it does so using machine learning, so you can give it 10 form fields, like read from form field type examples, and it uses machine learning to find 1,000 more. And then subsequently, it looks historically to say, well, I've seen this bad data path, or this data path from source to sink, from form field to database. And I've seen many, many projects modify that as an indication of there was a problem here, and they fixed it, and they did it in some bulks of consistent fashion. So there's a lot of machine learning around, like you have to still do the program analysis and understand the software, but then the machine learning really kicks in at understanding what's right and what's wrong based on an analysis of large volumes of quantities. And that in turn required a very, very smart, to do that at scale and in a timely fashion, requires some pretty significant innovations on the tech front to just do it fast enough, and absorb it.
Very interesting. The vulnerability database also sounds super interesting, and that's something you guys have been doing for a while, or is that more recent? What is it? What does that do?
From the beginning. So I kept harping on the developer first angle, but in practice, we combine developer first and security expertise. And in the context of open source vulnerabilities, I can have an amazing system that tells you which libraries you're using, but I need to tell you whether they're vulnerable. I need to know which vulnerabilities are known. And what happens is, in the world of open source dependencies, open source projects, an open source maintainer would fix a vulnerability, would say as much in the release notes, and that would sort of disappear into the ether of GitHub. And so we built actually from day one a threat intel system that listens. So we have a team now of about 25 odd people that have a system that reads a source of information, just like these like social feed torrents and things like that. We actually also technically read those social feeds. We read open source projects like Apache Jira projects and GitHub and many other sources. And we identify candidate vulnerabilities. That system has gotten very sophisticated over the years, and it uses machine learning to identify candidates. So some of it is simple, straightforward, like bring the NVD database in, and we'll identify, and some of it is much more natural language processing and other sort of combination of hints to be able to identify candidates. It's important for us though is that we are a curator. So any of those vulnerabilities we find, they're candidate vulnerabilities, and a human says yes or no, this is a vulnerability, and adds additional metadata. And those have become an asset that we have really, which is the vulnerability database, on top of which the products work, and also has become a great source of power for the ecosystem partnerships. And we have a variety of like Datadog and Dynatrace and Trend Micro, and like a lot of players in the ecosystem, the Linux Foundation, Google Chrome, many players rely on it now as their sort of information source for vulnerabilities, because there is no other good one really in the ecosystem.
Fascinating. Okay. All right. I'd love to spend a few minutes on the go-to-market side of this, which might be interesting to like anyone who's building a comparable company in terms of motion. So as you said at the beginning, like you guys initially started with open source security for open source, but you're actually not an open source company, right? You have a freemium model, not an open source. Can you talk to the thinking behind being freemium and not open source?
Yeah, for sure. So so to me, well, I have lots of thoughts about freemium, but fundamentally, freemium is about a use case. So what you want to do is you want to satisfy the needs of someone to do something. In our case, we defined our freemium tier as is twofold. One is we want to help open source projects secure their project, and so we made Snyk free for open source. So open source projects can use Snyk, at no charge, and can scale substantially. And that's I heard someone refer to it as cheaper than free. Not only is it's not open source, but it is actually even better for them because we also operate it and run it for them, and we do all of that. And then subsequently, and for those people, they helped us amplify the business. They help us, basically get awareness in the ecosystem. And some of those people work at companies. And then for companies, we built a more classic freemium model, which is at a certain volume and at smaller teams, you can use Snyk for free. And at some point, we'd like you to talk to a salesperson and maybe move up. So this bottom-up motion was very, very focused on developers succeeding, like having successful, delightful use of the product, started, really lower the bar, but why wouldn't you? Because every developer wants to build secure software. It's just very hard. And so we made it easy. And when you got to more larger scale or governance entities, that's really where commercial offering, where you kind of tip into the commercial. And we actually stick to that model today across the different products. We've made the free tier more and more generous. The open source piece is just a misnomer, which I think we inadvertently benefited from, just because it's like GitHub. GitHub is not an open source company. It's but it benefits from the halo of open source. But we do take care to be very good citizens in the open source community and ecosystem and give back. So
yeah, because it's free, right? Like for open source developers, that part is free.
Absolutely, and again, to an extent, it's probably a better service. Open source is not known for being very good at maintenance, so things like the vulnerability database and things like that, they don't really work that well in most cases if you just open source the code.
Yep. And again, can you talk to the, I guess, the go-to-market motion? So it sounds like you have this combination of, product-led growth, like developer-focused, sort of like bottoms-up strategy, just to throw a lot of buzzwords at it. And then presumably like an enterprise motion where you sell to the sort of management. Like how does that work?
So I think we successfully turned. So we have a different user and buyer. The security person is a user. It's an important user of ours, but we are, as I said at the beginning, dev first. We see the developer as the most important user of the product. But generally, you get the product that's purchased out of the security budget. In smaller organizations, in mid organizations, we see more and more development teams also purchasing, also platform teams and DevOps. But it's like a governance function or mindset that typically pays the bills versus a developer that needs to be using it on a daily basis. And so our sales model has always focused on that area. For developers, what we want is adoption, use it, succeed. And that also exists. That's also true in existing customers. They might have purchased a license for 50 developers and they might have 200. How can we show our value to more of those developers that are in their organization? And that's combined by more of a governance message and outreach that goes to security people. To the majority of our business is still freemium and inbound led. So we make noise in the ecosystem. We have actual free users that are scored and we send them a relevant email. We identify organizations, like a little bit outbound-ish is we identify organizations that have a lot of free users in the organization, but we reach out to them from outside. And that gets complemented a little bit with slightly more traditional out-of-band. But I think the key thing is that we take advantage or we leverage our freemium motion and community presence to bolster even the conversations with the buyers. I think you have to do that as well, or you have to be able to explain someone signing a large check, why is your product worth that amount? The groundswell gets you adoption, they get you in, they give you, it's kind of yours to lose, but you still need to be able to satisfy the CXOs or the sort of the senior person's needs when you talk about, $1 million deals and higher, and probably even lower down the pike.
Maybe I find that that whole thing to be fascinating. Maybe as a last question from me, and I think we have like maybe one or two questions from the group here. How does that scale from an organizational standpoint, right? Like, so the theory of building companies that way is like super interesting. Like, you spend your first few years just marketing to developers, sometimes open source, sometimes freemium. As you get to your stage, what does that look like? Do you have like one centralized marketing function and like one part does like DevRel? The other part does like buyer marketing. What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think in general, as the organization scales, you go from generalists to specialists. And so as the company grew, at the beginning, it was a bit all hands on deck, and that division didn't matter as much. Everybody was very connected to it. So the same product leads and marketing leads cared about both the freemium motion and the top-down motion, both the user and the buyer. As we grew, we have more and more specialization. Today, when you look at where we stand, we have a dedicated product-led growth motion, which manifests as a subgroup within product, a subgroup within marketing, and the subgroup within marketing has a DevRel view to it, which is more community-minded and such, and has a growth component to it, which is a bit more funnel management, a bit more understanding how many users did we get, what percentage of them activated and became successful users of them, how well are we monetizing those users. And so it's mostly led between product and marketing, but there are dedicated leaders and dedicated people under them, because it is true, and we've seen this as we went through, that it became hard for someone leading both the product-led growth side and the enterprise motion to say, no, I will put aside this like very large customer's requirement and I will prioritize this sort of freemium user need instead of that. So you have to make that decision strategically and provide resource isolation so that you wouldn't steal resources, you wouldn't starve resources away from the freemium motion, and also that there would be some people in the organization that are fully, right, that all they care about, I'm saying it in air quotes because they do need to have a bigger picture in mind, but their primary concern is the free user success, despite the fact dollars are not directly attached to them.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we have a few questions that came up, but we're sort of running out of time. So let's do them as rapid fire, if at all possible. So one of them is, what skills are appropriate to have a DevSecOps, to be, a DevSec person? Is there such a thing as people that have that job?
Yeah. It's a job that shouldn't exist because it's all about breaking barriers. But a DevSecOps person is very similar to an SRE. They should be a person able to build software, build services, and help developers successfully find issues and fix them, as opposed to an auditor who should be good at finding those issues themselves and doing it. So that's probably the primary transition.
Okay, great. When building a developer-first platform, how did you approach product design? What are the specific features that get developers in the door, and what features are the most important for dev teams, so presumably the buyer, to stick around?
Yeah, so for us, the buyer is maybe a bit more security, but the key thing is to think about the context, the bigger context of that user. And so for us, it translated to automated remediation, because a developer's job isn't to find issues, it's to fix issues, while an auditor, arguably, their job ends with finding issues. It translated to Git integration, like the workflows of where do they live. So what I would say, it really boils down to what's the broader context in which someone would run it, not just technically, not just shift left, run it earlier in the process, but rather what else are they doing, what do they know, and really try to put yourself in their shoes and reduce friction as much as you possibly can.
All right, very cool. So we actually have a couple more good questions, but unfortunately we're sort of over time. So Guy, thank you so much for coming and talking to the Data Driven NYC community, especially at a very almost 12:30 now, past midnight. So really appreciate it. It was a pleasure. We'll let you, I guess, go to sleep.
No, happy to be here, and I'll see if I can kind of type in answers to the ones that have been asked.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.